Story number 1. The Marionette. It was a quiet morning when the Johnson family moved into their new home on Maple Street, a charming old house that had been vacant for years. The walls were a dull shade of gray. The wood creaked beneath their feet, and the windows, though large, seemed to carry a kind of weight, as though they held secrets they weren't quite ready to reveal. Rebecca, the mother, was the first to notice it. She was sorting through boxes in the attic, the last place they needed to clear out. The attic had a peculiar smell, a mix of dust and something faintly like old wood smoke. It was there, buried beneath old furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets, where she found it. A ventriloquist's dummy. At first, Rebecca thought it was a joke, something her husband Carl had found at a yard sale. But there was something odd about it. The eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, seemed almost too real. And the smile, it wasn't a playful grin like most ventriloquist dummies. It was thin, stretched too far, as if it had been carved into place by some unseen hand. "Look at this," she called to Carl, who was downstairs unpacking the last of their kitchen supplies. She lifted the dummy out of the box, its wooden limbs creaking as if it were coming back to life. Carl walked up the stairs and froze when he saw it, his face drained of color. "I know that face," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca was confused. "You do?" Carl swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the dummy and then to the old photographs stacked haphazardly in boxes. The family had only just moved in, but the memories of the house's previous owners seemed to linger like smoke. That's Jasper. I remember him from my childhood. Jasper. The dummy had a name, Carl explained later that evening as they sat at the kitchen table. It had been a part of a famous ventriloquist duo back in the 70s. Carl remembered watching performances with his father, laughing as the dummy seemed to speak on its own. But there had been an accident, a fire that burned down the old theater where the shows were held. The fire claimed everything, including Jasper, or so Carl had been told. But now, here it was, in the attic, looking as if it had never seen the flames at all. Rebecca felt a shiver run down her spine as she placed it back in the box, but Carl seemed too distracted to care. He assured her it was just an old relic, nothing more. They decided to leave it there for now, but that decision would haunt them. Over the next few days, things began to change. Little things at first. Objects out of place. The sound of something scraping against the floor in the middle of the night. But the most unsettling thing was the doll. It was always in the corner of the room, watching, waiting. Carl tried to ignore it. He'd laugh off the occasional creak of the floorboards, or the sense that something was watching him. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that the dummy was somehow alive. It wasn't just a lifeless doll. It was like it had a presence that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Rebecca walked into the living room to find Carl sitting in front of the dummy. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the doll's face. He was smiling, but it wasn't his smile. It was the smile of a man who had lost control, who had surrendered to something far darker. "Carl?" Rebecca called softly, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. His lips moved, but the words that came out were wrong, not his voice at all. It was as if the dummy was speaking through him, pulling the strings of his thoughts and desires. "She will listen," Carl muttered, his voice a strange, guttural rasp. "She will understand." Rebecca backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The dummy, once so innocent, had become something far more sinister. It was as if it was feeding off their fear, manipulating them, drawing them into its web. The next day, the kids started acting strange. Sophie, their 8-year-old daughter, refused to speak to anyone except the dummy. She would sit for hours, whispering to it in the corner of the room, her fingers moving with unnatural precision as if she were pulling invisible strings. And Lucas, their teenage son, began to withdraw completely, spending hours in his room, staring at the walls as if waiting for something to happen. Rebecca had enough. She couldn't shake the feeling that the dummy was somehow controlling them all. That night, as Carl sat in front of the television, she made her decision. She would get rid of it. She climbed into the attic with the intention of throwing the dummy out, but when she reached the box, it was gone. Panic gripped her chest. She searched the attic frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. Then she heard it. The soft creak of the living room floorboards. The unmistakable sound of someone or something moving. She rushed downstairs, her heart racing. The living room was dark, but the moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. And there, in the center of it all, was the dummy. It was standing upright, its wooden limbs locked in place as if it had been waiting for her all along. But it wasn't just the dummy that terrified her. It was the smile on Carl's face, the same twisted grin that had haunted her nightmares since the day they found it. His eyes were no longer his own. They were empty, hollow, like the eyes of the puppet. Rebecca fell to her knees, gasping for breath. "Carl, please, what's happening to you?" Carl's lips twitched, his smile widening, but his voice, it wasn't his voice at all. "She's with me now," he whispered, his words dragging out like a rasping breath. "She'll make us whole again." The family was never seen again. Years later, new owners moved into the house on Maple Street, unaware of its dark history. They'd find the old photographs in the attic of a family that once lived there. And among those photos, they'd find one of a man, his face twisted in a grin, holding a ventriloquist's dummy named Jasper. And no one would question the strange feeling that came over them when they looked into the doll's eyes. Story number 2. Little Miss Madeline. When Claire Weston stood in her grandmother's old house for the first time after the funeral, she could feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't the comforting kind of quiet, the kind you feel when you're alone with your thoughts. No, this was different. It was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. The house had been her grandmother's pride and joy, tucked away at the end of a narrow street, shrouded by the tall oaks that lined the road. Claire had spent summers there as a child, running through the gardens, playing with her cousins. But now, it felt like a place stuck between worlds, suspended in time. Her grandmother, Evelyn, had always been an enigmatic figure, a woman whose eyes seemed to see things that no one else could. And now, with her passing, Claire was left with the house, and with the things Evelyn had left behind. It was in the dimly lit parlor, surrounded by dusty old furniture and faded photographs, that Claire found it. A porcelain doll perched on a shelf above the fireplace. Its delicate features were painted with an almost unnerving precision. Skin so white it looked almost translucent, lips painted into a perfect smile, and eyes that were far too real. They were glass, clear and dark, with a depth that seemed to stare into her very soul. She reached out to touch it, her fingers grazing the smooth porcelain. It felt cold, unnaturally so. The doll seemed to hum with something unspoken, as if it had a presence all its own. It was then that Claire remembered the stories. Her grandmother had always told her about Little Miss Madeline. The doll had been a gift from a traveling gypsy, a mysterious woman who had come to the house many years ago. Evelyn had never said much about the gypsy. but there was always an undercurrent of something dark when she spoke of her. Something that Claire had never quite understood. "Don't go near her," her grandmother had warned, her voice tight with a kind of fear that Claire couldn't place. "Madeline is not just a doll. She has a way of getting into your head. She's been here longer than any of us." At the time, Claire had shrugged it off. But now, staring at the doll in the cold, silent room, she wondered if her grandmother had known something she hadn't. That night, as Claire lay in the guest room, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. But sleep didn't come easily. There was something wrong. Something in the air that made her skin crawl. The walls seemed to whisper. Soft murmurs that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound was faint at first, like the flutter of pages in an old book. But then, it grew louder. A soft, insistent voice. No words, just a sound, like a hum in the back of her mind. Claire rolled over in bed, heart pounding, and tried to shake it off. But she couldn't. It wasn't just the whispering. It was the feeling of eyes on her. Eyes that she couldn't escape no matter where she turned. The next day, Claire decided to take a walk through the house. She couldn't explain it, but something felt off, and she needed to check things out. As she passed the parlor, she froze. The doll was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She'd left it on the shelf, right where it had been, its glass eyes staring at her. Now, it was nowhere to be found. "Grandma?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. She wandered through the house, calling out for someone, anyone. But the house remained silent, except for the whispering that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Later that day, Claire met with her aunt, who was helping her sort through the things in the house. They sat in the kitchen, a steaming cup of tea in Claire's hands, trying to make sense of the overwhelming feeling of unease that had settled over them both. "It's just an old house, Claire," her aunt said, trying to offer some comfort. "These places have a way of getting into your head. Your grandmother was always a bit superstitious." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. She had seen the doll again, standing on the table in the parlor, its painted smile as wide as ever, its glass eyes gleaming in the dim light. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't a coincidence. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects in the house were moved, always when Claire wasn't looking. A vase on the mantel would be shifted slightly to the left. A chair in the dining room would be turned at an odd angle. It was subtle at first, things she could brush off, but soon it became impossible to ignore. And then people started to disappear. It began with the neighbors. Old Mrs. Carlson, who lived down the street, had always been a bit of a recluse, but now her house stood eerily silent. No lights at night, no sign of her. When Claire knocked on her door, there was no answer. The same thing happened with other neighbors, one by one, until there was no one left. It was as if the house was slowly consuming them, drawing them into its dark, suffocating web. Claire's nights were filled with whispers. The doll would appear in places it shouldn't be. Sometimes it was on the mantel. Sometimes it was on the chair next to her, as if it had just moved there on its own. Each time, the smile on its porcelain face grew wider, more sinister. One night, in a panic, Claire tried to leave. She packed her things, ready to run, but as she stepped out the front door, a chill so cold it felt like ice clutched at her heart. She couldn't move. The world around her seemed to stretch and bend, as if time itself was unraveling. The whispers grew louder, and then, in a voice that sounded far too familiar, she heard it. "Don't leave me, Claire. You promised you'd stay." The voice was soft, lilting, almost like a lullaby, and when Claire turned, she saw her, Madeline, standing in the doorway, her glass eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The doll was no longer just a toy, it was the keeper of something dark, something ancient, that had been waiting for the right moment to be freed. Claire's heart raced, and her legs felt like they would give out. But she couldn't run. She couldn't move. Madeline had her now. The next morning, when the sheriff arrived to check on the house, he found it exactly as it had been. Silent, empty, and cold. There was no sign of Claire. The doll, however, was back on the mantel, its glass eyes watching him with an unblinking stare. And the whispers, though faint, seemed to linger in the air, as if they would never truly go away. No one ever saw Claire Weston again. But some nights, if you stand quietly outside the house on Maple Street, you might hear a faint whisper carried on the wind. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a soft, lilting voice that sounds strangely like a lullaby. It says, "Come closer, little one. I've been waiting for you." Story number 3, The Whispering Dollhouse. It was a Saturday afternoon when Liam first stumbled upon the toy store. He wasn't supposed to be there. His mom had told him to stay away from that part of town. The store had been abandoned for years, its windows grimy and cracked, and the once bright sign now faded and barely hanging on. But Liam, being the curious 10-year-old he was, couldn't resist. The door creaked open as if it hadn't been touched in ages, and inside, the air smelled stale, like old cardboard and forgotten memories. The aisles were stacked high with dust-covered shelves, most of them empty, save for a few forgotten remnants of a past long gone. There were no other customers, no friendly store clerks offering candy or toys. Just silence and the eerie creak of floorboards beneath Liam's sneakers. His eyes darted from one dusty corner to another. He wasn't sure what drew him there. Maybe it was the fact that no one had been inside for so long. Or maybe it was the way the store seemed to hold its breath, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. Then he saw it. In the farthest corner of the store, half hidden beneath a pile of broken toys, was a dollhouse. It was a strange thing. Old, but not too old. Intricate, but not too delicate. It looked like a regular dollhouse, the kind with tiny, perfect rooms and miniature furniture. Yet, something about it felt off. The wood was darker than it should have been, as though it had soaked up too many years of darkness. The paint was chipped, and the windows, small squares of cracked glass, seemed to stare back at him. Liam moved closer, his heart pounding a little faster than it should. The moment his fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the dollhouse, a shiver ran through him. It wasn't fear exactly, but something much worse. A sense that this was no ordinary toy. This was something more alive. He hesitated for a moment, glancing over his shoulder. The store was still empty, silent. No one was watching. So, with a deep breath, Liam knelt and carefully picked up the dollhouse. It was heavier than he expected, and as he cradled it in his arms, he couldn't help but notice how the painted faces of the tiny dolls staring out from inside the house seemed to almost, just barely, move. But Liam brushed it off. Maybe it was just his imagination. That night, after he'd taken the dollhouse home and set it up in his room, something strange began to happen. At first, it was subtle. He would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. Faint, distant voices that seemed to come from the direction of the dollhouse. At first, he thought it was just the wind, the creaking of old wood settling, or maybe even his mind playing tricks on him. But then, the voices began to speak more clearly. "Help us," they whispered. "Find us." Liam tossed and turned in his bed, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent, until he couldn't ignore them anymore. He sat up in bed, sweat damp on his forehead, and glanced over at the dollhouse. The little dolls that had once seemed so innocuous now looked different. Their painted eyes were wide open, their mouths frozen in strange, silent screams. They weren't just dolls anymore. They were watching him. The next night it happened again. But this time, when Liam approached the dollhouse, the whispers seemed to come from inside the tiny rooms. He leaned in close, listening to the words that were now crystal clear. "It wasn't always like this," the dolls whispered. "He made us. He used us." Liam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't understand. What were the dolls talking about? He reached out to touch one of them, a porcelain doll with long matted hair and a dress stained with what looked like dried blood. As his fingers made contact with its cold surface, a vision hit him, sharp and sudden. A flash of a dark, narrow room, with bloodstains on the floor and the distinct smell of rotting wood in the air. Liam yanked his hand back, gasping for breath. What was that? What had he just seen? The dolls weren't just dolls. They were holding on to something terrible. And then he realized it. The dollhouse wasn't just a toy, it was a portal. A door into something much darker, something that was waiting to be discovered. And the dolls were the key. Night after night, Liam's dreams became more twisted. The dolls began to move on their own, reenacting scenes from the vision he'd seen. A man with dark, hollow eyes, standing over a bloodied floor, using the dolls to carry out his grisly crimes. Liam saw it all. The way the man would position the dolls in grotesque poses, forcing them to act out his twisted fantasies. The man was a serial killer, and the dolls were his victims. They had been part of his horrific games, trapped in their tiny porcelain bodies, forced to repeat the horrors over and over again. Liam couldn't escape the images in his mind. They were with him even when he wasn't near the dollhouse, creeping into his thoughts during the day, waking him up in the middle of the night with their whispers. He realized, with growing terror, that the dolls weren't just telling the story. They were trying to make him part of it. They were trying to pull him into their world, where the killers still roamed. One night, after a particularly gruesome dream, Liam woke up to find that the dolls were no longer in the dollhouse. They were scattered around his room, each one positioned in a different, unnatural way. Their glass eyes glinted in the dark, and their mouths, once painted into silent smiles, now looked like they were grinning. Liam tried to leave the house, but it was no use. The dollhouse had its claws in him. The whispers grew louder, the dolls more demanding. "Come play with us," they urged. "We've been waiting." It wasn't long before Liam realized the truth. The dollhouse wasn't just a toy, it was a prison, and he was the next victim. It was the killer's mind that lived inside the house, his twisted thoughts seeping into the dolls, into the rooms, into the very air. And when Liam finally disappeared, no one was surprised. After all, the dollhouse had claimed others before him, and it would claim others again, each new child drawn in by its whispers, until the past was completely erased, and the only thing left was the killer's legacy. Alive and well, forever trapped inside the dollhouse. And the dolls? They would always be waiting for the next one. Story number 4. The Dollmaker's Revenge. Samuel Fletcher had spent his entire life perfecting his craft. He was a doll maker, but not the kind of doll maker that churned out cheap, mass-produced toys for the holidays. No, Samuel's creations were something else entirely. Lifelike, beautiful, disturbing in their perfection. Each one seemed to carry a soul, a presence that made them seem almost real. He had clients from all over the world, collectors willing to pay anything for one of his dolls. But no one knew the price of his talent. In the years leading up to his death, Samuel had become obsessed with his work. It wasn't just about creating beautiful dolls anymore. He was driven by something darker, a need to capture life, to preserve it in his creations. As he grew older, his health deteriorated, and the obsession that had fueled his work began to consume him entirely. In the final months of his life, he was bedridden, his body frail and weak, his mind deteriorating. But it wasn't just the sickness that gripped him. No, it was the curse. "You've done it now," he muttered to himself, his frail hands shaking as he clutched a small porcelain doll in his lap. "I've made them. Too real, too alive." Samuel's voice was raspy, barely a whisper, but there was a conviction in his words. "They'll never let me go, and they'll never let you go either." He was talking to the doll, though it seemed as if he were addressing something far beyond it. His eyes, once sharp and precise, were now clouded, unfocused. He knew what was coming, and it terrified him. With a final, trembling breath, Samuel passed away, his hand still clutching the doll. His last words were a curse, a promise that his dolls would continue to live, and that they would never stop seeking vengeance. After his death, the news spread like wildfire. Samuel Fletcher's dolls, his final creations, would be auctioned off. The rumors swirled around his name, but most people dismissed them as nothing more than stories for the curious. Who would believe in curses and spirits haunting dolls? Yet, despite the oddities surrounding his life, the auction went ahead, and his dolls, each one more exquisite than the last, were sold to the highest bidder. One by one, the buyers took home their prizes, unaware of the true terror they had brought into their homes. It started with Emily, a young woman who had long admired Samuel's work. She'd purchased one of his final dolls, a stunning piece with glassy blue eyes and a smile that seemed to follow her every move. At first, it was a simple curiosity. She marveled at the craftsmanship, displaying the doll in her living room where the light would catch its porcelain features in the most eerie way. But as the days passed, Emily began to notice strange things. The doll would move ever so slightly, its head tilting or its hands shifting positions. At night, she would hear faint whispers, low and indecipherable, like voices drifting from the doll's direction. Soon, the whispers became louder, clearer, until one night Emily awoke to find the doll standing in the middle of her room, its blue eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was paralyzed, staring at the doll, unable to move. The following day, Emily's mind began to unravel. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Every time she looked at the doll, she could hear Samuel's final words echoing in her mind. Too real, too alive. The whispers became demands. They wanted something from her. They wanted to see the terror she had been hiding, the guilt she had buried deep within herself. Emily's life spiraled into madness. She lost her job, her friends, and finally, her sanity. She was found days later, curled up in a corner of her living room, staring at the doll, mumbling to herself, "They won't let me go." But Emily wasn't the only one. Across town, Peter and his wife, Claire, had bought another one of Samuel's dolls. A beautiful little girl in a pale blue dress, with hair so fine it seemed like silk. At first, they thought it was a wonderful addition to their collection of antique curiosities. But soon, the doll began to show signs of life. It would giggle softly in the middle of the night, its eyes turning to watch them as they passed by. Sometimes they would find it standing in places it hadn't been before, its small hands clutched tightly around a tiny porcelain knife. At first, they laughed it off. After all, it was just a doll. But soon, the laughter turned to fear. The doll's actions became more erratic, more disturbing. It would rearrange itself in grotesque positions, its smile twisted into something that no child's toy should ever have. It was as if the doll was replaying some twisted, violent memory, a memory that wasn't its own. Peter became obsessed. He began researching Samuel Fletcher, the cursed doll maker, and the stories of his final creations. What he found was enough to send him spiraling into despair. The doll wasn't just a doll. It was a vessel for something dark, something evil, a manifestation of Samuel's twisted mind. It was too late for Peter and Claire. The doll had already taken hold of them. They became shadows of their former selves, driven mad by the curse. And in the end, when they were found, locked in a room, whispering to themselves, their faces were frozen in terror, their eyes wide open, as if they had seen something no one should ever have to see. The curse spread like wildfire. People who bought Samuel's dolls found themselves haunted by visions, by whispers, by the ever-present feeling that something was watching them. They relived Samuel's final moments over and over again. The desperation, the fear, the curse that had bound him to his creations. And no matter how hard they tried to escape, the dolls would always find them, always torment them. Each victim was more twisted than the last, driven to madness by the dolls, by the curse Samuel had laid upon them in his final breath. And no one was safe. Not the wealthy collectors, not the curious buyers, not even those who had never heard of Samuel Fletcher before. The dolls continued to live, carrying the weight of Samuel's vengeance, moving from hand to hand, tormenting and twisting their owners until they, too, became part of the curse. And in the end, Samuel's revenge was complete. His dolls, too real, too alive, would never stop seeking new victims. They would never stop haunting the living. And somewhere, in the shadows of a forgotten room, Samuel Fletcher's laughter could still be heard, echoing through the silence as the dolls continued to watch, always watching. Story number 5. The Collector's Doll. Liam Turner had always been obsessed with rare, antique dolls. His collection was the envy of every dealer in the city, each doll more beautiful, more precious, more haunting than the last. They sat in glass cases in his study, their porcelain faces staring out, each one carrying a story, a history. But it wasn't the stories that drew him in. It was the darkness, the unknown, the sense that just behind their delicate eyes, these dolls had seen things that no one should ever witness. But there was one doll, one that had eluded him for years. The Collector's Doll, they called it. It was rumored to have once been owned by a notorious cult leader, a man who had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of his dark practices. The doll was said to be a key, a vessel for something evil, something that had taken root long before it was ever crafted. Liam had heard the rumors, of course. He'd heard about the strange happenings surrounding the doll, the way it would disappear from its owners' homes, the strange accidents that seemed to follow anyone who owned it. But these were just stories, right? Nothing more than tales told to frighten children. So, when he finally acquired it through a private auction, he thought nothing of the price he paid. The doll was beautiful, unlike any he had seen before. It was an exquisite porcelain figure, dressed in a faded black gown with gold trim, her face painted with a serene expression that didn't quite match the dark, hollow eyes that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The doll's fingers were delicate, and its posture was unnervingly lifelike. Liam set her up in the center of his collection, admiring her for a moment before turning to tend to the rest of the room. But as he moved around the study, a strange feeling washed over him. It was a pressure in the air, an oppressive weight that seemed to settle in his chest. He dismissed it as fatigue, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, the strange occurrences began. It started small, a shadow in the corner of his eye, a creak from the floorboards when he was alone in the house. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks, the house settling in its old age. But the longer the doll remained in the room, the more intense the sensations became. At night, he would wake to the sound of whispers, soft and unintelligible, as if someone was speaking directly into his ear. When he tried to investigate, he would find nothing, no one. And then the doll began to move. The first time it happened, he was sitting in his study, reading through an old catalog of antique dolls. When he glanced up, the doll was no longer sitting perfectly still in the center of the room. It was facing the other direction, its head slightly tilted to the side. He froze, staring at it, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe he had moved it and forgotten. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. But the next morning, the doll was even further out of place. It was no longer in its usual spot on the shelf. It was lying on the floor, face down, its delicate porcelain limbs twisted in an unnatural angle. The expression on its face seemed more sinister now, as though it was no longer simply a doll. It was something that had crossed over from a nightmare. Liam's obsession with the doll grew. He couldn't explain why, but the more he looked at it, the more he felt compelled to keep it in the center of his collection. The other dolls, the ones that had once given him comfort, now felt distant, lifeless. It was as if they no longer mattered. All he could focus on was the collector's doll and the pull it had on him. Days turned into weeks, and the events became more frequent. The whispers at night grew louder, clearer. They were no longer just unintelligible murmurs. They were words, commands, threats. "Stay close," they would say. "Obey. You must obey." Liam tried to ignore it at first. He tried to pretend that he could still control his life, but the longer he kept the doll in his house, the more he began to lose himself. His work began to fall apart. Clients stopped calling. His friends and family noticed the change in him. He became irritable, distant, haunted by something he couldn't understand. He even started seeing things, dark shapes moving at the edge of his vision, voices calling his name when no one was around, and the doll was always there, watching him, waiting. Then, one evening, it happened. Liam came home to find his house in disarray. The front door, which he was certain he had locked, stood wide open. His belongings, books, furniture, even the paintings on the wall, were scattered, thrown across the floor as if a storm had passed through. But there was no storm. Only the doll sitting in the middle of the mess, staring directly at him. He approached it, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached out to touch it, the doll's head jerked to the side as if it had moved on its own. The cold porcelain felt wrong beneath his fingers. Too smooth, too lifelike. And then, in a voice that was not his own, the doll spoke. "Not much longer," it whispered, its lips barely moving. "You will be mine." Liam's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar but distorted, like a memory he couldn't quite place. His eyes darted around the room, and for the first time, he saw it clearly. The house wasn't just disordered, it was a maze. The walls seemed to be closing in on him, the rooms shifting, becoming unfamiliar. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, and the door to his study was no longer where he remembered. He tried to run, to escape, but the house would not let him. Every door he opened led to another. Every hallway wound in on itself. The walls pressed in on him, and the whispers grew louder. "Obey," they chanted. "You cannot leave." His mind began to crack under the pressure. The collector's doll had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. Liam understood now. It wasn't the doll itself that was the curse. It was the evil that resided within it, an ancient force bound to the doll by the cult leader who had once owned it. The doll wasn't just a toy, it was a vessel, and now it had him. In the end, no one ever found Liam. His house, once a haven for his collection, was left abandoned. The doll remained in the center of the room, its porcelain face forever frozen in a haunting smile, its dark eyes glinting with the knowledge that it had claimed yet another victim. And as the years passed, the rumors began again. Another collector would come across the doll, intrigued by its beauty, unaware of the evil it carried with it. Another life would begin to unravel. Another house would become a labyrinth of horror. And so the cycle would continue, as long as the doll remained. Story number 6. The Doll in the Attic. When Emma and Jack Whittaker bought the old Victorian house on Hawthorne Lane, they thought they were getting the deal of a lifetime. The house, with its sagging windows and faded charm, had been sitting on the market for months. No one seemed to want it. The price was more than reasonable, and with their second child on the way, they saw it as the perfect opportunity for a fresh start. At first, everything seemed fine. The creaking floorboards, the drafty windows, the old fixtures, all the signs of an aging home, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with a little elbow grease. The neighborhood was quiet, a gentle kind of peace settling over the house, as if it had been waiting for the right people to come along and breathe life back into it. But there was something about the attic. It wasn't that Emma or Jack were afraid of attics. They'd both grown up in old houses, and attics were just places where things were stored. But when they first moved in and found the door to the attic, it had been locked. Odd, Emma thought, but probably just a quirk of the old house. She didn't give it much thought until Jack finally managed to pry the door open, one rainy Saturday afternoon. The attic was small and cramped, the air thick with dust. Jack and Emma had hoped to use it for storage, to stash away the things they didn't need but couldn't bear to part with. But as they pulled the first box out of the way, Emma spotted it. A doll. It sat in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of old books and furniture. It was lifelike, disturbingly so. Its porcelain face was painted with rosy cheeks, and its glass eyes, though cracked and dull, seemed to follow her every move. The doll was dressed in clothes that were far too old-fashioned for a child of the 20th century. Long, flowing skirts, lace collars, and shoes that seemed to have been made for a different time altogether. At first, Emma thought it was a relic, something left behind by the previous owners. But when she reached out to touch it, she recoiled. There was a coldness to the doll, a strange, unsettling chill that didn't make sense in the warmth of the attic. She turned to Jack, who had already moved on to another box. "Jack, look at this," she said, holding the doll out to him. He glanced at it, shrugged, and said, "Old doll. We could sell it or throw it out, I guess." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The doll felt wrong in her hands, like it was alive in a way that no doll should be. She put it back where she'd found it, but not before a lingering feeling of unease settled over her. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the doll's pale face haunting her thoughts. She tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. When she finally drifted off, it was only to dream of a child, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a dress just like the one on the doll. The child called out to her, but the voice was faint, distant, as if coming from behind a wall. The next morning, Jack was already up, flipping through a stack of old newspapers he'd found in the attic. He looked up, his face pale, and set the paper down in front of her. "I found something," he said quietly. "Look at this." The headline read, "Local girl disappears without a trace, no leads found." Beneath the headline was a photograph of a small child, her face framed by dark curls, her eyes wide and innocent. She was wearing a dress that looked remarkably like the one on the doll. Her name was Margaret, Jack said, his voice shaking slightly. She lived in this house. She disappeared in 1923. No one ever found her. Emma's heart raced as she stared at the photograph. The resemblance between the girl in the picture and the doll was undeniable. But it couldn't be. Could it? Jack scrolled through more articles, his eyes widening with each page. The story was always the same. Margaret had simply vanished one night. Her parents had searched for days, then weeks, but there was no sign of her. The police had no leads, and eventually they stopped looking. The case went cold, but the articles also mentioned something strange. The neighbors had reported seeing strange figures at the house in the days following Margaret's disappearance. Figures that moved in and out of the house at odd hours, never speaking to anyone. Some said they were visitors from a cult that had once been active in the area, practicing rituals that involved children. Emma's mind raced. Could the doll be tied to Margaret's disappearance? Was it possible that it had been here all along, waiting for someone to discover its terrible secret? The more Emma thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. She started spending more time in the attic, combing through old boxes, trying to find anything that might explain the doll's connection to Margaret. But the deeper she dug, the more the house seemed to shift around her. Rooms that once felt familiar now seemed foreign, as if they had changed overnight. The walls seemed to close in and the air felt thick, as if it were trying to suffocate her. Strange things began happening. Doors that she was sure she had locked were found open. Lights flickered on and off. The doll, which she had left in the attic, would appear in different places. On the couch, in the kitchen, even at the foot of their bed. Its glass eyes glinted in the dark, always watching. Emma became obsessed with the doll. She couldn't stop thinking about it. She began to have dreams, nightmares about Margaret. In the dreams, the child would stand at the foot of her bed, staring at her with those hollow eyes, silently pleading for help. And in those dreams, Emma would always hear the same whisper, faint but growing clearer each time. "Help me, don't let them take me." Jack, too, became affected. He grew withdrawn, tired. He would spend hours in the attic, flipping through old books, desperately searching for answers. But the more he learned, the more the house seemed to fight back. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, trapping them in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Finally, one evening, Emma found it, the final piece of the puzzle. Tucked away in an old, dusty journal, she discovered a story about Margaret's disappearance, but this one was different. This story spoke of rituals, of sacrifices made to dark forces, and of a doll, Margaret's doll, that had been used in the final ceremony. The ritual had failed, and Margaret had paid the price. The doll, it seemed, was a vessel that had trapped Margaret's spirit within it, binding her to the house, to the walls, to the attic. And now it wanted something from Emma. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She heard footsteps in the hall, soft and steady, moving closer to her bedroom. She turned to Jack, but he wasn't beside her. The bed was empty. She sat up, the air heavy with an electric charge, and slowly made her way to the attic. There, she found him. Jack stood frozen in front of the doll, his eyes glazed over, his face pale. His lips moved, but no words came out. Emma reached out to him, but before she could touch him, she saw it. The doll was smiling. Not the delicate painted smile it had once had, but a wide, twisted grin that stretched unnaturally across its porcelain face. And in that moment, Emma knew the truth. Margaret hadn't disappeared. She had never left. She was still here, waiting. The doll, the house, the nightmare, they were all part of the same curse, and Emma and Jack were the next victims. As the doll's eyes locked onto hers, Emma felt the house tighten around her, its walls pressing in, its dark history swallowing her whole. Story number 7. The Doll's Eyes. Emily had always been estranged from her mother, Carol. Their relationship had never been easy, filled with arguments and unspoken words. After her mother's sudden death, Emily thought she had finally put that chapter behind her. The house was sold quickly, the papers signed, and the memories buried. But there was one thing her mother had left her: an old, weathered doll. It was a strange bequest, considering how little they had spoken in the final years of Carol's life. But it was the last thing Emily had, the last connection, and so she took it. The doll was unlike any she had ever seen. Its porcelain face was smooth, almost too perfect, and its glass eyes, those eyes, seemed unnervingly real. They were a dull shade of brown, but the longer Emily stared at them, the more alive they seemed. The doll wore an old-fashioned dress, faded and torn in places, with a bow tied around its neck. It was delicate and beautiful, and yet there was something deeply unsettling about it. At first, Emily thought nothing of it. She placed the doll on a shelf in her living room, surrounded by other trinkets she'd collected over the years. But from the moment she set it down, something felt off. It wasn't just the doll itself, but the way the room seemed to shift when she wasn't looking at it. The first night, she woke up to find the doll facing the other direction, its head slightly turned toward her. She chalked it up to her imagination, maybe the way the light had shifted, but a small knot of unease formed in her stomach. The next day, things grew stranger. As Emily moved around the house, she felt a constant weight, a pressure she couldn't quite place. And always, those glass eyes followed her. No matter where she stood, the doll seemed to be watching. She began to wonder if she was imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Then the whispers started. It was faint at first. A whisper so soft it could have been the wind or the creak of the house settling. But the next night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were calling her name, soft, urgent, as if someone was standing just behind her, waiting for her to turn around. Emily would spin, heart pounding, but there was never anyone there. The doll, though, remained, watching. One night, unable to sleep, Emily found herself drawn to the doll. She hadn't meant to, but her legs moved on their own, guiding her toward the shelf where the doll sat. She knelt down in front of it, staring into its glassy eyes. And then, something happened. The room around her seemed to melt away. The walls faded, and she was no longer in her living room. Instead, she stood in a dark, foggy place, an endless void. And there, standing in the middle of the mist, was a figure. It was her, but not her. The figure was older, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes wide with terror. It was a future she could never escape. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out to her, her hands grasping for something, anything, and then Emily jerked back, gasping for air. The doll was still in front of her, its eyes as cold and lifeless as ever. But the vision had been so real, so terrifyingly real. The whispers grew louder after that. Every night they came, insistent, pleading. And as the days passed, the visions became clearer. Each time Emily looked into the doll's eyes, she saw another piece of the future. The figure, her, was always there, always reaching out, always calling for help. And no matter what Emily did, she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll knew something she didn't. That it had the power to pull her into that future, to make her live it. But she couldn't let it happen. She couldn't. She tried to move the doll, to hide it in the attic, but the next morning it would always be back, sitting on the shelf where it had first been. No matter where she placed it, no matter how far she pushed it away, the doll always returned to watch her, to follow her. She became desperate. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, always hearing those whispers, always seeing that face in her mind. She locked herself in the room, away from the doll, but it still reached her. The walls of her house closed in around her. The doll's presence was inescapable. Its eyes burned into her consciousness. Finally, one cold night, Emily couldn't take it any longer. She sat before the doll, her trembling hands reaching out toward it. She wanted to destroy it, to end this madness, but something inside her wouldn't let her. It was as if the doll had taken hold of her, as if it had already won. When she looked into the doll's eyes one last time, she saw it clearly, the vision of her future. This time, it was no longer a distant figure in the fog. It was her, standing in a room that looked like hers, but it was cold and empty. Her face was pale, hollow, her eyes wide with fear. And as the figure reached out, it wasn't asking for help anymore. It was pulling her in. The doll was not just a doll. It was a force, a presence, a curse tied to her bloodline, passed down from her mother, Carol, who had once lived with the same terror, the same whispers, the same visions. She had seen it too, had fought it too, and it had claimed her in the end. And now it had claimed Emily. As the doll's glass eyes glittered in the dim light, Emily felt her body stiffen. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices calling her name, pulling her into the future she had seen, the future she could never escape. Her hands reached out toward the doll, and as they did, the room seemed to close in around her. The walls faded into darkness, and the doll's eyes, cold and unblinking, were the last thing she saw before everything went black. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the house empty. No sign of Emily, no trace of her anywhere. Only the doll, sitting innocently on the shelf, watching the empty room. And its eyes were still following, waiting for the next one. Story number 8, The Puppeteer's Curse. Lila knew she wasn't supposed to take the doll, but the temptation was too strong, stronger than the warnings of the old man, stronger than the voice in her head telling her to turn back. It wasn't every day that you found a doll like this, so beautiful, so lifelike, and yet so wrong. She had seen it the day before, tucked away in a dark corner of the puppeteer's cart. The traveling show had come to town, just like it did every year, and for as long as she could remember, Lila had been fascinated by the puppets. There was something magical about them, something that made her heart race every time the strings pulled tight and the marionettes danced in the flickering light. But this one, this doll, was different. The puppeteer had been a strange man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face always hidden in the shadows beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He never spoke much, only smiled faintly and set his puppets to work. But when Lila had wandered closer to his cart, her eyes had locked onto the doll sitting in the back, sitting still and silent, but watching. It was a girl, no older than Lila herself, with dark, soulful eyes and a face so delicate it seemed to hold 1,000 emotions. Her dress was an elegant thing, a deep crimson with intricate lace, but it was the doll's eyes that drew Lila in. They weren't just glass. They were alive. The doll seemed to be looking right at her, as if it could see into her very soul. "Don't touch it," the puppeteer had said, his voice low and gravelly, but the words held a warning that Lila didn't fully understand. But she didn't listen. That night, when everyone in town was asleep, Lila slipped away from her house, clutching the doll in her arms. She didn't care if it was wrong. The doll felt like it was meant for her, as if it were calling out to her in a way no one else could hear. At first, nothing happened. Lila kept the doll hidden in her room, away from her parents and their questions. She would sit by the window and stare at it for hours, watching the flickers of moonlight dance across its porcelain face. But as the days passed, something began to change. Strange things started to happen, things that Lila couldn't explain. It began with the first storm. It was a late afternoon, the clouds heavy and gray, the wind howling outside. Lila had been playing with the doll when the thunder struck. The air had grown thick and electric, and suddenly the doll's face had twisted into a grin, an unnatural grin that stretched far too wide for a porcelain face. At that moment, the lights in the house flickered, then went out completely. Lila had jumped, staring at the doll in disbelief. Her hands trembled, and she tried to turn the doll away, but it was as if it refused to be moved. The doll's eyes remained fixed on her, its smile stretching further, the porcelain cracking at the edges like it was straining to hold something back. And then, the whispers started. At first, Lila thought she was imagining it, but soon she began to hear them clearly, low and hushed, coming from the direction of the doll. The whispers weren't words, not at first, but more like a breath. Close, too close, as if someone was right behind her. When she turned, there was nothing there, only the doll, its eyes now wide and empty, and that grin still there, somehow even wider. Then things got worse. The following week, her mother fell ill. It wasn't anything serious at first, just a headache, then a fever. But by the end of the week she was bedridden, too weak to get out of bed. Lila hadn't thought much of it at first, but when she visited her mother she noticed something strange. Her mother's eyes seemed to glow faintly, just like the doll's. She would murmur to herself, and when Lila asked her what was wrong, her mother only smiled and said, "I feel as though something is watching me." Lila felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it had something to do with the doll. That night, as the rain beat against the windows, Lila couldn't sleep. The whispers had grown louder, and the doll's grin seemed to widen even further. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was going on. She went to the puppeteer's cart, hoping to find some answers. But when she arrived, the cart was empty, the puppet strings hanging limp in the quiet night. As she turned to leave, she saw a small, leather-bound book lying in the dirt by the wheel of the cart. She picked it up, brushing the dirt from its cover, and opened it. The pages were filled with strange drawings, puppets, marionettes, and in the center of the book, a single image of the doll, her eyes dark and endless. The text beside it was simple, written in jagged handwriting. "The curse is passed to whoever takes her, and so too will it claim their soul. Lila's heart raced as she read the words over and over, but as she tried to stand, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The world around her spun as she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, and when she turned, the puppeteer was standing there. His eyes were no longer hidden by his hat, and what she saw chilled her to the bone. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets like the eyes of the doll. "You should have never taken her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was never meant to leave me." Lila dropped the book, her legs weak, and backed away. But as she turned to flee, the doll's laughter echoed in her mind, a sound like broken strings and splintered wood. By the time she made it home, things had already begun to spiral out of control. Her mother's condition worsened, and the whispers grew louder. No longer just a voice in the air, but voices. Hundreds of voices, all calling her name. She could feel them pulling at her, drawing her into their darkness. And then, the doll's expression changed again. Her smile was no longer wide, it was a sad, twisted frown, and her eyes were full of pain. It was as if the doll knew it had claimed her, knew it was pulling her into the same fate that had befallen the puppeteer before her. The curse had begun. No matter where Lila went, no matter how far she ran, the doll's eyes would always follow. And with every step, with every whisper, the curse tightened its grip, dragging her deeper into the darkness, just like it had with the puppeteer before her. And just like the puppeteer, there was no escape. Story number 9. The Doll That Never Sleeps. It was a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and the night seemed to stretch on forever. The trees lined the streets like silent sentinels, and the old houses stood huddled together, their creaky floorboards echoing with memories of generations long gone. It was the kind of town that felt stuck in time, where nothing ever changed, except for the rumors. And one rumor, in particular, had been whispered among the kids for years. It was always told around campfires or passed between friends with a mischievous grin. The story of the doll that never sleeps. They said it had been passed down through generations, always staying in the hands of the most trusted families in town. The doll was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. Her glass eyes were too bright, too knowing. Her porcelain face was painted in such detail that it looked like she might start speaking any second. She was always kept on display, carefully placed in the living room of whatever house she resided in, never moved, never touched. The legend said that the doll was never, ever supposed to be allowed to sleep. If she did, if she ever closed her eyes for even a moment, she would awaken, and when she did, she would bring nothing but chaos. Most people didn't believe in the legend. It was just a story, they thought, nothing more than a childish fear. But the ones who had grown up with it, the ones whose parents had passed it down, couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the doll was more than just a creepy old toy. And then came the group of teenagers, bored and eager for a thrill. The kind of kids who thought they knew everything about the world. There was Derek, the leader of the group, and his girlfriend Emily, always following him, ready for anything. Then there was Matt, the skeptic, and Sarah, the quiet one who never seemed to say much but always had an air of curiosity about her. It was Derek who first brought it up. "You know, we've heard the story 1,000 times," he said one night, leaning against the brick wall of the local diner. "But we've never actually tested it. What if it's all just a myth? What if it's all in their heads?" The others laughed, thinking it was just a joke. But the more they talked about it, the more it seemed like a fun idea, an adventure. If the legend was true, they'd be able to prove it. If it wasn't, they'd have a good laugh. The plan was simple. They would break into the old Waverly house, the place where the doll had been kept for generations. It had been abandoned for years, and everyone knew that it was the right house, the one where the doll had been passed down. So, that night, as the moon rose high above the sleepy town, the teens made their way through the dark streets to the old house, their hearts racing with the excitement of defying the rules. The door creaked open easily, as if the house had been waiting for them. Inside, the air was musty and heavy with the scent of dust. The wooden floors groaned under their feet as they stepped into the living room, their flashlights illuminating the old furniture and the cobwebs hanging in every corner. And there, sitting on a pedestal in the center of the room, was the doll. She was more beautiful than any of them had expected. Her porcelain skin was pristine, her eyes shimmering in the dim light, her delicate dress falling in soft folds. But there was something about her that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. It was the way she looked at them, as if she knew exactly why they were there. Matt, the skeptic, stepped forward. "Well, here she is," he said with a grin. "So, what now? Are we supposed to just make her sleep?" Derek laughed. "Exactly. We'll let her sleep and see what happens." They all gathered around the doll, their faces lit by the flashlight beams. Sarah, the quiet one, hesitated. "What if it's real? What if—" "Shut up," Derek interrupted, his voice teasing. "We're here to prove a point. It's just a doll." He reached out and gently pushed the doll's head back, closing her eyes. The moment the doll's eyes fluttered shut, the room seemed to grow colder. The air grew thick, as if something had shifted. For a moment, nothing happened. They all stood there, waiting for some sign, some change. But the doll remained still, her porcelain face serene. "See? Nothing," Matt said, his voice a little too loud in the silence. "It's just an old wives' tale." But as the words left his mouth, the room seemed to shudder. The walls creaked, and the lights above them flickered. A gust of cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. The teens stood frozen in the dark, a sense of dread creeping over them. Then they heard it. A faint noise, like a soft scratching sound. At first, it was distant, but then it grew louder, closer. The sound was coming from the doll, and then her eyes opened. But they weren't the same eyes. They were darker, deeper, filled with an unfathomable rage. Her smile had stretched unnaturally wide, and her body shifted as if it was no longer a lifeless thing, but something alive. The room seemed to tilt as the doll began to move. Her limbs jerked, twisting in ways that no porcelain doll should be able to. Her head spun toward the group, her eyes locked onto them with an intensity that made their hearts race. "Get out," Emily whispered, backing away, but it was already too late. The doll, once still and silent, was now a creature of nightmare, a puppet controlled by an ancient force that had been trapped for generations. The house began to tremble, and the air grew thick with an unnatural pressure, as if something was pushing in from all sides. A voice, low and guttural, came from the doll's throat. "You woke me." The teens scrambled, desperate to get out of the house, but the doors slammed shut as they tried to run. The windows shattered, and the sound of the doll's laughter, inhuman, twisted, echoed through the halls. One by one, the teens fell to the horrors the doll unleashed. Matt was the first, dragged into the darkness, his screams echoing through the house. Sarah was next, her body twisted into unnatural positions, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Derek and Emily tried to fight, tried to run, but the doll was always one step ahead. It controlled the very house, twisting it, warping it into a labyrinth that led them deeper into the dark. And as the last of them fell, The doll's eyes remained open, watching, waiting. The curse was never meant to end. And now, the town would remember the legend forever, not as a story but as a warning. The doll that never sleeps would continue, its thirst for vengeance never quenched, its rage never spent. And it would never stop. Not until the town paid the price. Story number 10. The Doll That Stares. Maggie Thompson had always loved getting gifts for her daughter Lily. But the doll was different. It arrived one cold, drizzly afternoon, wrapped in brown paper and tied with thick twine. The letter accompanying it was short, written in a neat, elegant hand. It was from her distant cousin, Eleanor, someone Maggie hadn't seen in years. The letter explained that it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations. It was a special doll, handcrafted by Eleanor's grandmother, and she thought Lily might appreciate it. At first glance, the doll was beautiful. Its clothes were a deep red velvet, embroidered with intricate patterns of gold thread. Its porcelain face was painted with remarkable detail, delicate features, pale cheeks, and lips curled into a soft, peaceful smile. The eyes, however, were what stood out. They were black, an empty, lifeless black that seemed to swallow the light. When Lily opened it, she smiled, delighted by the intricate craftsmanship. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. Something in the way those eyes seemed to follow her, no matter where she stood. She brushed it off as her imagination. Nothing more than the odd feeling you get when you're handed something unfamiliar. But the longer the doll sat in the corner of Lily's room, the more Maggie began to notice strange things happening. It started small, tiny movements, almost imperceptible at first. Maggie would catch the doll's eyes from across the room, and for just a moment they would be staring at her. She would blink, thinking she must have imagined it, but the doll's gaze was always there, waiting for her to look again. One morning, she swore the doll had shifted slightly on the shelf, but when she went to check, everything seemed fine. It was still there, perched exactly where it had been, with those dark, staring eyes. Then, one evening, as Maggie was in the kitchen preparing dinner, she heard Lily's giggle from the living room. The sound was light, carefree, but there was something strange about it. Maggie peeked around the corner to find Lily sitting on the floor with the doll in her lap. The doll's eyes weren't looking at Lily, though. They were locked on Maggie. Those deep black eyes, cold and empty, fixed on her with a chilling intensity. "Mommy," Lily said, her voice sweet but distant. "The doll wants you to play with it." Maggie froze, her hand clutching the edge of the counter. She hadn't told Lily anything about her own discomfort with the doll, but Lily had spoken those words without hesitation, as if she had been talking to the doll, not Maggie. A cold shiver ran down Maggie's spine. "I'm not sure I want to play right now, sweetie," Maggie said, trying to sound calm. She could feel the doll's gaze following her every move, even as she turned away. That night, as Maggie lay in bed, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. The house seemed quieter than usual, the air heavier. She couldn't sleep, her mind racing with thoughts of the doll. She had always believed in logic, in reason. There was no such thing as haunted dolls, no matter how strange it seemed. But the eyes, those eyes, they weren't right. Around 2 a.m., she woke up with a start, sweating, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay still, listening to the silence, and then she heard it. A soft creak, like footsteps in the hall. Maggie's breath hitched in her throat. She tried to tell herself it was just the house settling, but something about the quiet seemed wrong, as if the silence was waiting for her to react. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and she glanced toward Lily's room, the door slightly ajar. Maggie hesitated, unsure of whether she should check on her daughter. Then she saw it. The doll was standing in the doorway, its black eyes staring right at her. Maggie gasped, her body going rigid. She was certain she had left the doll in Lily's room earlier that evening. She had even tucked it back into bed with Lily when she'd gone to check on her. But now, it was standing there, its porcelain feet eerily still on the wooden floor. The doll's eyes locked onto Maggie's, and for a moment, it was as if time had stopped. It felt like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Maggie swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for the lamp on her bedside table. As soon as she flicked the switch, the doll was gone. She rushed to Lily's room, but the bed was empty. Her heart raced as she scanned the room. The doll was back on the shelf, perfectly positioned, its eyes fixed on Maggie. The room was still, and Lily was sound asleep in her bed, oblivious to the strange events unfolding around them. The next few days were a blur. Maggie tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the doll's presence seemed to grow stronger. She would catch glimpses of it from the corner of her eye, always watching her, always waiting. And every time Maggie looked away, it seemed to move ever so slightly, just enough to make her doubt her own sanity. It wasn't just the doll's movement that terrified her, it was the way the house felt. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Maggie couldn't breathe. The doll's stare followed her through every room, its dark eyes never leaving her, as if it was studying her, waiting for something. It wasn't long before Maggie started avoiding the room entirely. She kept the door to Lily's room locked at night, but even then, she would hear the soft scraping of the doll's feet against the floor, like it was moving, always creeping closer. It felt like the doll was trying to get out of the room, trying to reach her. One afternoon, Maggie could take it no longer. She picked up the doll and with trembling hands threw it in the basement. She locked the door behind her, thinking that maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to stop the doll's relentless gaze. But as the sun set that evening, she heard it, the soft thump of porcelain hitting the floor, then the slow, deliberate creak of the basement door opening, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. Maggie backed into the corner of her kitchen, the doll's eyes locked on her, its black gaze cold and unforgiving. She tried to scream, but her throat was tight, choking on the terror that had consumed her. The doll had not just come to life. It had a mind of its own, and now it was coming for her. And as it reached for her, Maggie finally understood. She was trapped. The doll wasn't simply haunted, it had claimed her, just as it had claimed the house, just as it had claimed the lives of everyone who had owned it before. And now, Maggie would never escape its stare. The doll had finally won.